Okay, this is going to be chapter 28. I'm going to do kind of a more extensive review of this chapter and most of the last third of chapters, just because, I don't know about you guys, I didn't really watch the lectures, so I read the textbook a bit more thoroughly for these. So the learning objectives for this chapter are as follows. Explain why the Bank of Canada targets interest rates directly rather than the money supply. Understand why many central banks have adopted formal inflation targets. Explain how the Bank of Canada's inflation targeting helps to stabilize the economy. Describe why monetary policy affects real GDP and the price level only after long-term lags. And discuss the main challenges the Bank of Canada has faced over the past 4 decades. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a quiz, and then I'm going to walk you through my notes a bit, and then I'll do another quiz live at the end and go through my process that way. So let me just, can I lower that? Whatever. Okay, so this one is, it's kind of annoying. Let me try to, there we go. Can I move you? Perfect. Okay. Policies that help prevent bank failures include, so a bank failure we talked about before, a bank run. What that means, it's when everyone tries to get their money out at the same time, but that's hard for banks because they have so much of their money loaned out. They have very few in reserves, so it requires them to keep some money in reserves. So I would have thought it would be preventing banks from holding two reserves, but it's actually just to increase the capital requirements of banks. So I guess that's the same thing, but it's just increasing it as opposed to preventing. It's a more proactive measure. So suppose the bank's announced target for the overnight interest rate is 2.7%. What can we expect commercial banks to borrow and lend overnight funds at a rate? Why? So what does that mean? So we'll go into the notes a bit here. So the bank rate here, so the bank will set an interest or a rate that they call the bank rate, and 0.25% above that rate is what they're going to lend commercial banks at. So they'll say, I'll lend you this money and it's going to cost you this much, and 0.25% below that, they're going to pay interest to the banks. So what that means is this overnight rate, the overnight rate is the rate that banks charge each other for loans. So if they know that they can get that specific rate from the Bank of Canada, they themselves are going to act within that range. So because they know they can borrow from the Bank of Canada at 3% and lend to the bank at 2.5%. So that's the range that they're going to stay within. Okay. High inflation is costly to firms and individuals. Of the following, who is most adversely affected by high inflation? So high inflation is really bad for anyone who is earning a fixed income, right? Because the real value of their income is decreasing every year as prices go up if it's not indexed. So it's going to be most costly to a senior. All of these other ones indexed, this one's indexed. A mortgage, we learned this in business. Every 5 years, you change the rate based on the interest rate. But if there's inflation, this is actually going to be good for a fixed rate mortgage because over time they're going to be paying less real dollars out, so it helps them. And this is nominal terms paying a debt away. Again, inflation is good for people that are in debt because it means they have to pay less if it's not indexed. So it's a senior. Time lags in the conduct of monetary policy can cause. So back to the notes down here. Why are there lags? Let's just... Perfect. So there's 2 reasons why there are lags in monetary policy. The first one is that although changing the overnight rate changes the actual rates very quickly, once the bank changes their bank rate, the overnight rate, and all of the mortgage rates and everything, they all adjust really quickly. The banks all adjust really quickly. But as a consumer, you might not go, oh, I see the interest rate drop by 0.25%. That doesn't make me want to go buy a house right away, right? So it takes a long time to you to say, oh, okay, like the rate is going to be lower for a long time. Now I'm going to go buy the house. Same thing, firms, they may not adjust their investment policies right away. It may take them a little bit of time. And then the other reason why it takes time, why there's lags, is that the multiplier process will take time as well to fully multiply and see all of those effects, because it has to go through various people, right? So economists estimate that it's between 9 and 12 months for the change in policy to have its main effect on GDP, and then another 9 to 12 months to have its main effect on the rate of inflation. So what that means is that if it's not forecasted right, you could actually lead to destabilization, because you're going to have to do this policy like maybe even 2 years in advance of it happening. So you have to have really good forecasting. So that's why it's difficult to time it. Going through these other ones and why they're wrong. So expansionary and contractionary policies have the precise effect. So no, it's not precise. Right? What can it cause? So it can cause monetary policy to work in the opposite direction to what was initially predicted by economists. So monetary policy, no, it's going to work in the same direction that they originally predicted, but at the time, so let's say right now we're in a recessionary gap, but in 2 years, economists predict we're going to be in an inflationary gap. The right response then would be to tighten monetary policy so that in 2 years we prevent that inflationary gap. Like it's going to have the same effect, but they just have to time it right. It won't work very quickly, and short-term monetary policy to be more effective than long-term targeting, no, that doesn't really make sense. All right, next one. Given its existing policy regime of inflation targeting, the Bank of Canada would likely react to a large positive aggregate demand shock by. So, aggregate demand shock, we'll draw that over here. Here's our Y star, AD, AS, and then there's a positive aggregate demand shock. My fan is going crazy, but oh well. So what's going to happen? So right now there's inflation, right? Because we're not at equilibrium, and we don't want that. So how are they going to fix that? Well, they're going to try to bring us back down to here. They're going to bring us back down to here. How are they going to do that? That means we need to get AD back down to there. And we do that by lowering, to make AD go to the left, we need to lower AE. And how can the bank lower AE? Well, they can do that through the interest rate. If they increase the interest rate, remember they can affect the overnight interest rate, then that's going to decrease investment, and that will shift us back there. So that's what they're going to do, and that's the other example would be if they did nothing, then our AS curve would shift, right? Our AS curve would shift. But now we're at a higher price level, so that means that there's inflation, and that's not what the bank wants. So they're going to increase the interest rate in that case. Okay. If desired investment spending is relatively sensitive to changes in interest rates, then monetary policy would be very useful because it would. So this question, even without knowing what this is, you can probably get this right just based on the wording, right? So it says it would be very useful. So if it's very useful, then we probably don't want it to be very ineffective, right? Or somewhat effective. So that only leaves B and C. And then if we're going through this, again it says ineffective. This is the only one where it's effective. So that just makes the most sense, right? And if you think about it, if desired investment spending is relatively sensitive to changes in the interest rates. So if we change interest rates, desired investment spending is going to change a lot. Well, that would be useful if we could reduce expenditure during inflationary periods, which is what we just saw, and if we could expand expenditure during recessionary periods, which would be the opposite. Suppose the Bank of Canada chooses to expand the M2 measure of money supply by exactly 10 million. The bank could implement this expansion by. So don't worry too much about like the M2, M1, M2 plus, that kind of stuff. That's just like different how they classify different money things. But it's all essentially the same thing, and David Johnson never talked about it, so I wouldn't worry too much about which goes in which. The bank could implement this expansion by. So because they can't, so what they want to do is they want to increase the money supply by exactly 10 million. So, but what they can't, how they would do that, right, is they would buy something. The bank has a bunch of money that's not in circulation, just in their basement. So when they buy something, it's with that money that's not in circulation, and then that money goes into circulation, and they have this thing, whatever it is. It's usually government securities. And the opposite, if they want to get rid of money, what they do is they sell something. Because when they sell something, they take someone's money, and that money is no longer in circulation. And usually what they sell is government securities. The problem is, it won't, when they sell or buy something, they can't sell the exact amount because of the whole deposit creation thing, right? So if they want to expand the money supply by exactly 10 million, then they're going to have to buy something to put money into the system, but it has to be less than 10 million. It has to be less than 10 million because of the multiplier effect and deposit creation, and we're going to see the total amount that it creates would be more than 10 million. So none of these would increase it by exactly 10 million. By exactly. That's why. Most economists now accept the position that to reduce the long-run rate of inflation, there must be sustained monetary contraction. So if you don't want inflation over time, we're going to see monetary contraction. That kind of makes sense. In the long run, monetary policy should be aimed at maintaining full employment without regard to inflation. So that makes no sense at all. The whole point of monetary policy is to change inflation. It has nothing to do with employment. And high inflation, even if it is largely expected, can generate significant costs for the economy. Of course, as we just mentioned, like those seniors that are earning the fixed incomes, that's a large cost. Also, anyone who's lent out money, the real value of the money being paid back is now lower. Suppose the economy has an inflationary gap. To decrease the level of aggregate desired investment, the bank could. How do they decrease investment? Well, they raise the interest rate. Pretty simple. We've talked about that before. And last one, the interest rate that commercial banks charge each other for the shortest period of borrowing or lending is called the overnight interest rate. A lot of these are not things. The prime rate is a rate that banks lend to like their most valued customers that they're sure are going to repay it. I've never heard of the term interest rate. The bank rate is the rate that the bank sets, and then that range happens, and that becomes like the overnight interest rate pretty much. And the preferred lending rate, again, I'm not sure what that is at all. So that's it for the quiz. To go through some of the other things here in this chapter. So the bank obviously can target the money supply or the interest rate, but what we see is that they don't target the money supply for 3 reasons. So the first one is one that we sort of talked about, is that it cannot control the process of deposit expansion. So even if they put more money into the economy, they don't know exactly how much money is going to be in the economy after they've put it in because of the whole lending out or not lending out. Maybe banks don't choose to lend out. They don't really know. So they can't really control that. They also don't know about the slope or the position of the money demand curve because it's kind of like a theoretical thing. It's not easy to measure. And that causes it. So like if we draw it and then like that, they don't know what this MD curve looks like or where it is. So they don't know if they increase MS, how much interest rate is going to fall. They can't figure that out. So it's not a useful policy for them. And then why instead should they target the interest rate? So they can control the interest rate a lot more easily through setting a bank rate, and then and that'll change the overnight rate. And the slope of the MD curve doesn't really matter to change the interest rate because you can change the interest rate by the exact amount that you want, and this will adjust accordingly. Now, obviously, if you want to, this is I and this is Q money. If you want to decrease the interest rate by 5%, say, if you want to decrease it, Well, how do you do that? Then you're going to have to increase MS. The trick is you're decreasing the interest rate first, and then you're increasing MS. You're not doing the MS first. And so the slope of the money demand curve doesn't really matter. And then the last thing is it's more easily communicated to the public, because it's easy for John Crow or whoever else is managing the Bank of Canada to go, okay, the new interest rate is 3%. Everyone understands what that means. If you go up on that stage and instead say, we're injecting $40 million into the economy, nobody really knows what that means, right? People don't have this graph memorized, and they don't know that an increase in the money supply is going to decrease the interest rate and that they should then go buy a house or something. It's very hard for the bank to communicate that. So instead, they do the interest rate, and it's easier to communicate to the public. We talked about the bank rate. We talked about this high inflation. What was kind of discovered early 2000s, I believe, or maybe a little bit earlier, was that sustained inflation is caused by monetary policy. This was discovered by Milton Friedman, who's an economist, a pretty famous one. So what that means is that the only way that we'd continue to have inflation is if the bank continues to validate it. And we'll see what monetary validation is in chapter 29. But the important point is just that sustained inflation is caused by monetary policy. And then the bank is going to monitor core inflation instead of the CPI. So the CPI is the average price of this whole basket of goods, but it has things in it like oil and energy prices and various fruits and things that the prices shift a lot more throughout. So there's a graph that shows in the textbook the difference between core and CPI, and CPI is a lot more volatile. They usually shift in the same direction, but CPI will shift in more than core. And so there was an example where the CPI inflation dropped a lot because taxes on cigarettes went down. So that may have indicated that there should have been some sort of monetary policy by the government if that's what they were monitoring. But if they actually looked at core inflation, it was still pretty close to their 2% range, which showed that they didn't have to do anything. So they monitor this core inflation, which it's basically the CPI, but it has a couple things removed from it, like oil and various things that I guess fluctuate a lot. And then a couple of examples to go over here. So if there's an increase in foreign demand for Canadian exports, so that would shift, ignore this graph, that was for something else. So, actually I can just delete that. Okay, so if there's an increase in foreign demand for Canadian exports, so that means our NX is going up, right? So that's going to shift. If our net exports goes up, we see an increase in AD. And then so what that means too is that our dollar is going to appreciate. Our dollar appreciates, which is a good thing. But what that means is that the bank should tighten the monetary policy, because this is causing inflation, and we don't want that. We want to come back to here. So how do they do that? They raise the interest rate, because when interest goes up, investment goes down, which makes AE go down, which makes AD go left again, which brings us back to that point here, which is supposed to be more over there, but whatever. And they do that again by raising the interest rate. They don't do it by changing money supply. On the other hand, another scenario is instead the bank, there's an increase in foreign demand for Canadian assets. So assets in the economic sense are not goods and services, they're financial assets. So what does that mean? That is going to, what's that going to do? Well, it makes our dollar more valuable. So our dollar still appreciates, same as the previous case. But this time, goods are more expensive, and we haven't seen an increase in any of investment. It hasn't increased our investment. It hasn't increased our net exports. What it's actually done is, because our prices have gone up, our net exports have gone down. So that is going to cause AD to go to the left. So in this case, the government should loosen monetary policy to get us back this way. Sorry, not the government, the bank. The bank should loosen monetary policy by lowering the interest rate. So the bank has control over monetary policy. This is the Bank of Canada. And the government has control over fiscal policy. So there's an argument between two economists. So one was Milton Friedman, and the other was John Maynard Keynes. So Friedman was a monetarist, and what monetarists argue is that monetary policy will be more effective in stopping inflation. So if you're on Milton Friedman's side, then you say you should use monetary policy. If you're on the Keynesian side, Keynesians argue that fiscal policy will be more effective. So that's a change in government spending or taxation to get us back to this equilibrium. I don't know how important that is. It's barely mentioned. David Johnson didn't go over it, but just some trivia, I guess. And then the last thing here is just like some history that was in the textbook. We had a deep recession in the early 80s, but by 1987, GDP was back at potential. How they did this was the bank allowed a quick growth of the money supply and then reduced it pretty quickly afterwards to reduce expectations of renewed inflation. And then after 87, there was still rising inflation. So the rate that they settled on was 4% inflation, which is pretty high. So John Crow decided that monetary policy will now be focused on price stability. John Crow was the head of the Bank of Canada at the time. But inflation still increased up to 5%, and there was an increased demand for Canadian assets, which led to a reduction in AD, as we saw here. So that put us in a weird spot. And then between 91 and 2000, they decided to lower inflation. So they started with 5 to 3, and then they went to 4 to 2, and then they eventually got down to a 1 to 3% range. This caused a deeper and more prolonged recession because they were going so far down. But there was a good stock market at that time, which was increasing wealth. And then just at the end, around 2000, there was the dot-com stock market crash, and stocks went down by like 40%. So that caused a bit of a recession. 9/11 caused another stock market crash, but then oil prices increased, and Canada exports a lot of oil, so our AD shifted right. That gave us a big appreciation of the Canadian dollar, and the bank also dropped the overnight rate by a lot. And then in 2008, this whole stock market crash happened. What the bank did to combat that was they reduced its target for the overnight interest rate by 3.5%, and they made short-term loans to financial institutions more accessible, straight out of the textbook. And then now in present, the price of oil has dropped lately, which has shifted our AD left, and we're on a slow economic recovery. So not much happened. So now I'm going to go through a quiz. This shouldn't take too long. And then we'll be done chapter 28. So, suppose Canadian real GDP is currently equal to potential GDP. Then, because of events elsewhere in the world, European investors decide to hold fewer Canadian financial assets, which leads to a sustained depreciation of the Canadian dollar. If the Bank of Canada is committed to its inflation targeting, then it should. So we had a depreciation of the Canadian dollar. What that means, our goods are cheaper, so our net exports has gone up, which we saw in a previous example. So to get them back, which means AD has shifted right. So to get AD back to its original, they should implement a contractionary monetary policy, and they should do that by raising its interest rate, the overnight interest rate. I hope I get all these right. Suppose the Bank of Canada's announced target for an overnight interest rate is 2.75%. Why should we expect commercial banks to borrow and lend? So we did this one already in the previous, at the beginning, so it's that one. To remove an inflationary gap, the Bank of Canada would probably seek to. So an inflationary gap, how would they remove that? They could increase their target for the overnight interest rate, because that would move AD back down. I'm trying to think of, yeah. Yeah. In general, if a central bank chooses to target the interest rate in its implementation of monetary policy, then okay, what are they going to do? The central bank can more easily control the process of deposit creation. No, wrong. They can't. They can't control it at all. It conducts the necessary open market operations to accommodate the resulting change in the money demand. That's true. So they change the money supply accordingly in order to incorporate that interest rate. The implementation of policy is more straightforward because the central bank knows precisely the slope. No, they don't know the slope. The money supply is determined by the Minister of Finance. No, they don't determine the money supply exactly. They determine the interest rate exactly. And it is more difficult to communicate this policy to the public. No, it's easier to communicate the policy to the public. In practice, the Bank of Canada uses monetary policy to reduce undesirable fluctuations in real GDP they do that by changing the interest rate, so by changes in the target overnight interest rate. None of the other ones. Next. We did this one already. Suppose the Bank of Canada increases its target interest rate by 0.25. So if they increase their interest rate, did I graph that? Maybe not. Oh, over here. They want to raise the interest rate up to here. Oh, my camera's in the way. Up to here. So how do they do that? They have to reduce money supply as well. How can they reduce money supply? Well, if they buy something, if they buy government securities, that's putting money into the economy, so we don't want that. But if they sell government securities, that's taking money out of the economy, which will reduce the money supply. And that will raise the interest rate. Well, the interest rate will be raised already. High inflation is costly to firms and individuals. Who is most affected? We did this already. It is a senior who's fixed. And because of the volatility of food and energy prices, the Bank of Canada pays more attention to short-run changes in the core inflation rate than to changes in total CPI inflation, right? There's a lot of volatility of food and energy prices. We talked about that already. And last question. Come on. Quantitative easing by a central bank refers to... this is a David Johnson question, and it's a little confusing because it's not the lowering of the bank rate, but it's actually, it would be the lowering of the interest rate, and how they do that would be increasing the money supply. So the purchase of long-term bonds would put money into the economy. Nice, 10 out of 10. Alright, that was chapter 29.